again, and welcome back. This video is going to follow up the last video that we had because I realized there was a couple things that maybe need a little more explanation. So in our previous video, we created these counters, and we have each counter counting, like increment and decrement. And then we also added an add counter button that lets us add a new counter, and a delete button that lets us delete a counter. Okay? So, you know, there's some other things going on underneath here that make this work, right? And also I left a piece out that we're going to need. So I'm going to open up the console in the browser first, and we're going to talk a little bit about the virtual DOM and how the virtual DOM deals with lists of things. So first of all, I'm going to go to the inspector here and then go to the console, and you'll see I have a warning here. It says, warning, each child in a list should have a unique key prop. Okay, warning. So it's a warning, it's not an error that our program broke down. But what it's telling us is that I'm using a list, and I'm using a list because count.map returns an array. Right? So if I was to imagine if I simplified all the code here, it would look like this. I'd say count.map, right? And then map returns all of the, it receives the value, and then it returns the values that it transforms, right? And then it returns an array. Right, so really what I have here, like if I started with this and I did all the code in here to transform some things, right, and those things were returned, in the end we would have a new array here. So if I looked at the next line here, if we thought like what happens here, when we're done, we'd actually have an array, right? And it would be an array of counters. So, essentially we could look at this array as looking kind of like this. Right? So it looks like two counters, okay? And so what happens is when a React sees an array, if it has JSX elements in it or components, right, then it renders those components. Okay, so it just creates a list of them, right? So let me get rid of this just for a moment. Let me comment that out, right? And when I look at the elements here, you can see I've got a div called root, and then there's a div called app. That's this guy. And then here, if I look, there we go, right? So then if I look here, you can see I got counter number 1 and counter number 2, right? These are the divs, right? And then inside here, you'd have your buttons and your other things, right? So I can see the two of them. It rendered them as a list. Now, if we remember that React uses the virtual DOM to manage all the changes that happen in the DOM, if you have a list of items, React won't know if those items are updated if the list changes, right? So if the list changes, the virtual DOM isn't sure which items in the list have changed, right? And that's why it wants us to include a unique key prop, right? So if we give each one of these items in the list a key, then React can say like, okay, you updated the list, but I'm going to look in the list and check the keys and see if those keys changed, because if an item that has a particular key hasn't been modified, then I don't need to update the DOM. Okay, so how do we assign a key prop, right? So to do that, what you're going to do is, so first of all, React just renders a list, right? And we can actually test that here. Like I could say like curly brackets, and then we could make a list here. Maybe I'll do a list of paragraph tags, right? I don't know, right? So /p, and then I could say a, and then I could put comma, and then I could do another paragraph tag with the b, like this, right? And then you can see I got a and b here. So as soon as React sees that you have a list. If they're components or JSX, then it'll automatically just render them. You don't have to write a loop to do that. But it's going to say like, hey, if one of these things in the list changes, how will I know which one that is? Because I want to be efficient. I don't want to re-render everybody in the list. I only want to pick out the elements that have changed, like if this B changed to a C, right? Okay. And then it doesn't want to update the A, okay? So how is it going to do that? Well, we're going to do it this way. We're going to go into our component. So in my case, it's a counter, and I've added some props here: label, value, delete count, increment, and decrement. And remember over here in the console, it told me that actually now the error went away. Maybe if I refresh, yeah, there we go, right? It says each child must have a unique key prop, right? So what we want to do here is we want to add a new key prop. So we'll say key, and then we'll give it a value. So the value has to be unique for everybody, right? We can't use the same key, otherwise React might not know which element to update, right? You can generate the keys in any way that you like. Usually it's not good to use the index. It's better to have a more, I don't know, more robust key, more interesting key. So I'm actually just going to copy what we have here, and I'll paste it in here, and maybe I'll give each key the name counter and the index. So one will be key 0, then key 1, and key 2. Okay? So I'll save that. I'll refresh my page, and then I'll look in the console here and check the console. Oh, good. Error is gone. Okay, so or my warning is gone. Okay, so that's the key prop. So this only applies when you have a list. So you notice I don't have to put a key on app here. If I go into counter, I don't have to put a key on any of these things because they're not in a list. Okay, so if you have a list, we should include the key prop, and we should set it to a unique value. So if you have values that are coming out of an array or a database or something, you could use an ID or some other piece of information there, or you could generate a key prop yourself, and it just needs to be a string, but it needs to be different for each element in the list. Okay? Okay, so cool. So we got that out of the way. Let's talk about one other thing. And now this is kind of more a JavaScript than a React specific idea, okay? And the idea here is that like when I render this and I render 3 items in my list, or let's just render 2, right? So I'll render these 2 items there, right? 4 and 8, right? Okay, when I render those, and you click on the delete count or you click on the increment, and it wants to use the I variable and the value, right? Let's imagine we did this, right? We ran the map, we created 2 counters, and when we were creating the first counter, value was 4 and I was 0. And then we create the second counter, value is 8 and I is 1. Okay, and those counters have been created. Okay, now when I click on this plus button here and it runs the code here, that happens at a later date, far in the future for computer times, right? How does it know that the value is still 8 and the index is 1? Okay, so this is a concept called scope, right? And there's a little more to this, but we'll just call it scope for now. The idea here is that when you create a function, right? So here I have a function inside of map. So it begins here, right? And then it extends all the way down to this curly brace over here, okay? Or actually, wait, this curly brace over here, this parentheses, right? So it goes all the way from here to here, right? Okay, so that's our entire function, okay? When this function is created, JavaScript creates what's called an execution context, right? And in that context, any variables that are created are stored so that function can use them, okay? And in this case, I have 2 variables that I'm storing, okay? It also grabs the variables that are in the outer scope, right? So it has access to count, set count, right? It has these two, and that kind of makes sense in this context, but it also has these two variables. But what's going to happen is the next loop, when map goes to the second item in the array, what's going to happen is it's going to create a new execution context. And the two variables here, val and I, are created again, okay, in that new context. So, for example, like if we wanted to kind of look at this as, kind of graphically, right? I'm going to copy this function right here, and we can kind of imagine it. Actually, let me do this. I'm going to copy it like that. I'm going to kind of tab it once, right? There we go, right? And let's tab this over again. Okay, so let's copy that. And then let's imagine, like, I'm going to just go to Sketch here and paste it, right? So this is my first function. So imagine that when we called that function inside map, like map calls this function once, it creates an execution context. So that's, imagine this text object is the execution context, okay? And that means that these two variables here, val and I, right? Imagine that they got a value. So val got a value of 4, and I got a value. Actually, maybe I'll even put this outside here. Let's say val equals 4, right? And I equals 0, okay? So that's our execution context, right? And then maybe we'll make this, maybe that red is not a good color. Let's do orange. There we go, right? Okay. So we have this, right? The next time around the loop, what happens is we create a new execution context. And it's kind of like we have a copy of all of that code, except this time the value here is 8 and I is 1, okay? So that means that when these functions are created here, they capture the variables in their outer scope, and they capture val right here and I right here, and they have the value of 4 and 0. It's kind of like this function is going to remember the state of these two variables, okay, because they're going to capture it from the outer scope, okay? So if we do anything in here that uses val or I, this is going to be the value that it uses, okay? In this execution context here, if we do anything with the variable val or I, the value is going to be 8 this time. So over here inside this context, val is 8, I is 1, okay? So down here you can see I've got I, that's going to be 1, and val is going to be 8. Okay, so that's an idea. It's kind of an advanced idea with JavaScript, but that's how the language works. Like when you create a function, that function takes in or captures variables in its outer scope so it can use them in the future when it's going to be executed. Okay. So anyway, so I thought that that would be a good follow-up video for the last couple videos, just so we can explain a couple kind of more complicated things that were happening here behind the scenes, right? And anyway, thanks for watching. And then in the next video, we'll begin the new project, okay?